I'm Heidi, down here in the bottom, and feel free to come on camera. I don't mind. You will be recorded, just so you know. But today we're going to talk about exploring sensitivity labels in Microsoft Fabric. A little bit about me. By day, I'm a data analytics consultant. I am based in South Australia. I do have an MVP award. I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer. Love challenging myself and taking some of the certifications that Microsoft have to offer. I've chucked a few there. I think I'm at about 14 at the moment. I love doing all things ALM, DLM, which is Application Lifecycle Management, Database Lifecycle Management. And of course, I am hugely a fan of hanging out with the community, traveling all around the world, doing user groups, doing conferences, doing events like this, virtual or in person. I love it. And you can find me on the socials. I'm on Twitter, and feel free to check out my blog. It's a bit well and truly behind. I hope to get kickstarted back into that at some point. Today's agenda, we're going to go through and look at what are sensitivity labels first, so you have a bit of an idea of what they are and what they can do. We're going to look at licensing considerations, because you know it is a thing that needs licensing. We're going to go through how to set them up, just briefly sort of an overview so you're a bit familiar with that process, how we can use them specifically in Fabric, and then where you can see them in Fabric, and then finalise it with how we can actually monitor the use of those sensitivity labels. So the first thing to be aware of is what is a sensitivity label. So you often hear it in the spaces of Microsoft Information Protection, Azure Information Protection, sometimes it's short acronym to MIP, because Microsoft Information Protection. Sensitivity labels, it is different to classification labeling that you'll see in Microsoft Purview. Sensitivity labels do appear in Purview as sensitivity labels, but the two can go hand in hand. But for sensitivity labels, they are a clear text value of metadata that you can put against a data asset. So it is just that, it's a label, it's a way to classify the information and the data you're looking at. So when it comes to things like Fabric, it's a way to classify the items, but it's also a way to classify the reports that you work with in the Power BI experience. It is something that doesn't necessarily provide a security mechanism for the most part. So when you are in Fabric, you will notice that if you've got access to a workspace, even if you don't have access to that sensitivity label, you can still get access to the contents. So be mindful of that, for the most part in the data platform, it's not considered a security aspect, it's considered a label. But there are other spaces, because sensitivity labels go across more things than the data platform and Power Platform Fabric. They go across things like Office 365. So anything that's like Word documents, Excel, email, SharePoint, Teams, those sorts of things also use the exact same sensitivity labels. So it is across your organization and across your data estate. And you got to be mindful of what values you use, because you don't want the list to get too long. But these labels are just that, a label. Now, what we can use to actually get access to these labels is a number of different licensing options, because it is a feature stood up in Office 365 first. So it's the Office 365 compliance area. So it actually falls into the new Microsoft Purview portal as well. But previously it was the Office 365 Admin Management Compliance Information Protection labels. So to get access to those features, you either need Azure Information Protection Plans P1 or P2. An Office 365 E5, so that's a single E5 on your tenant to enable the feature. When you're trying to use those features within Fabric and Power BI, you're going to need Power BI Pro or Premium per user to be able to apply a label to an item. Now that you've got the licensing established, what we can do to set up those labels is a little 3-step process here provided by Microsoft. So the first thing that needs to happen is the label needs to be created on the tenant in the Office 365 space, and then it needs to be published with a policy. Now that policy dictates who can have access to the label itself, and also any restrictions on that label. And we'll talk about those a little bit further. The second thing is that label then has to be applied to something. And then once it's applied, there are options for third-party and Office products to apply some protections to those. So those protections may be not enabling you to open, say, the export to Excel file, because you don't have access to the label. So in that case, it will apply security, but not inside Fabric itself. So to set it up, if you've never seen the Office 365 Admin Center, this is the base homepage. From there, you're going to go into Compliance. And then within compliance, you want to be in one of these admin roles. So either you're going to be information protection admin, analyst, investigators, or readers. Those are the roles within Entra that will allow you to access this feature and to be able to set it up. Within compliance, you're going to go into information protection and then into the labels section of information protection. And then within there, you can actually define your labels. So this is an example of a brand new tenant that has no labels defined. When you do define labels, you can see them here, but you can also see them in the new Purview portal. So here you can see I've got a number of labels defined. These labels I've also published and put a policy with them. And with these, it's important to note that the priority, so the lowest number is the highest priority. And why does that become important? Because most of the items within Fabric can only have one label. In fact, all of them. You can only ever attach one label. But if you're thinking about what you're doing within Fabric and Power BI, where you're integrating multiple data sets, they may have different labels applied. And so when you're combining them into the one report with a bit of a mashup, they can only get one label. So they will take the highest priority label. And it also means if you have users who are downgrading the priority of an item, so let's say they're going from confidential to official or open or public, something more broad, then you can ask them to provide a justification to why they're changing that, and that gets recorded in the Office 365 audit logs. And then with that, you can also know the different classifications available. So if someone does change it, or you're choosing to roll out an information protection policy, so not the actual policy within the feature, but a business policy within your org, you might say, hey, this is the process for selecting which sensitivity label you're going to apply to a data asset. And here are the rules around its use. But you can also provide information on the different priorities so that people know, hey, if this is confidential, these are the restrictions we need in place. If you're going to change it to public, this is what it is going to mean. But for each label, we get a number of things we can set up. So we can, of course, set up the name and the description, and those are visible as tooltips hover over points when you're using the labels throughout the various Microsoft products. You can also set an internal label description as well, so that can help your administrators understand who's authorized to change the label, who's authorized to set up different labels, those sorts of things. You can talk about protections, so that's things like encryption and watermark. So watermark is, think about Word, where you can drop a background watermark text on your documents, doesn't apply in the Fabric space. You can also set the scope, so a label can be defined for only use in, say, email or SharePoint, but you can also define it for schematized data sets, things like Purview. The offline access and online access under encryption means you can specify that, hey, if someone's accessing this label, they can't download the content. If they download the content, its offline access is either, a period of days. So you could say no offline access, which means every time they were to open, say, the Excel file, it's going to recheck, hey, does the user opening this Excel file have access to this label? If they do, open the file. If they don't, error and indicate that they don't have the ability to access the contents. That comes into play when you're looking at things like export to Excel and analyze in Excel. Because publish the label, when we publish it, we specify who has access to it. That can be a user or users or groups or group and groups. So you can have multiple setups there. And we can talk about having mandatory requirements. So you may say for every Power BI item, I want a label to be enforced. And that means any Power BI item that's created will have to have a label applied. And so that can be handy when you're starting to roll out information governance in your org, because you can go, hey, every single report that someone publishes is going to be unclassified. And then that can be a way for your organization to say, if I'm going to use this report to make business decisions and it's unclassified, we first need to go through and review the report, review the data set, get it endorsed, and make sure that it's a data set we can use for business purposes versus something that's just a sandbox people are playing around with. And there's other things you can do in that space. You can also provide a help URL to indicate more information about each of the labels. Can take up to 24 to 48 hours for a label to be available in your tenant. For the most part, when I've spun them up, it's very quick to be available in my tenant. But once we do have that label, so now we've got the ability to use a piece of metadata against different items, but it's only defined in the Office 365 space. Now we need to tell Fabric that, hey, I want to allow people in my org to use those sensitivity labels for Fabric items. So within the Fabric admin portal, we've actually got a number of options under information protection. And I do wish they had like a subheading menu on the left now. The admin portal is getting quite long. It does have a search up the top, so you can just type information protection because this is about 3/4 of the way down the admin list. So what you want to do is allow users to apply sensitive labels to content. Without that enabled, they can't publish anything that has a sensitivity label applied. It just doesn't take it into account. So you want to make sure you enable it. But when you do enable this feature, you have the option to specify enabling it for your entire org or for a subset. So if you're considering piloting this before you actually adopt it wider in your org, you might have a series of business champions you want to pilot it with first and then open it up to other users in your org. This allows you to specify either that you can go just to a security group, the full org, or an exclusion. So you can say everyone but this group here, and that group could be external B2B people, because whilst this is a sensitivity label is a Office 365 setting, it doesn't work across B2B tenants. So if you're doing B2B or B2C, you won't be able to use information protection in the same way you would for your internal organization staff. The other thing we want to be able to do is potentially automatically apply the sensitivity label for downstream content. So that's that scenario I talked about earlier where if someone publishes a data set, or what is it now, semantic model? I'm going to get that wrong, I'm sure. Then when they publish that and you start building reports off it, those reports automatically take the label of that data set. So they will automatically inherit it. You'll get a notice to say that in Excel, it's a little policy tip. In Power BI, it's similar. It's the nice little informational message to say, hey, because you've got this downstream option selected, you will automatically have this particular sensitivity label applied to anything you're building. And in addition to that, if you ever change the label, so if you're, say, in a lakehouse and you change the label, you'll get a little pop-up saying, hey, we're changing the label. Do you want to see the impact of this? So you can see where that label may have been used in that particular lakehouse may be used with other assets downstream and therefore to affect the labeling overall. There's another few options there that are more on the newer scale. The bottom one I'll call out while we're on the screen, the PBIX files. So PBIX files can have the sensitivity label applied, and it should, in theory, block the user from being able to open the PBIX. So if someone did have the ability in a workspace to download the PBIX from the workspace, but they didn't have access to the label that's applied to it, when they try and open the Power BI desktop file, it should error. But be mindful that that doesn't apply to the PBIP. So if you're using the PBIP format, which I do recommend people use, the project format, the label itself is not on that. So you can open those in things like VS Code and other different products. Now that we've got our admin tenant settings enabled, we can go all out and start using the sensitivity labels within Fabric and within Power BI. So with the Power BI options, we can apply it to almost every single asset. So the dashboards, the reports, the data marts, the data sets, the data flows, the paginated reports, everything but notebooks, which is very odd, I find, because Excel is the notebook. Excel published is a notebook, workbook, I should say, workbook. But Excel can apply a sensitivity label, but as soon as you upload that to Fabric, it will disappear. The label will just not show, which is odd. But that's how it is, so just be aware of that. With paginated reports, I've put a little asterisk. You have to apply it on the service. So if you build a paginated report in the report builder itself doesn't have the ability to apply any of the sensitivity labels. So once you publish that up, you'll be able to edit it. But for a lot of the others, so if you're in Power BI Desktop, if you do open up Desktop and you notice that it's sort of grayed out effect, that means one of two things or three things. Either you're on a tenant that doesn't have sensitivity labels set up at all, which is possible. If they don't have an E5 or an information protection plan, you're not logged in, because in order for it to know what labels you have access to apply to something, you have to be logged in, or it's not enabled on the tenant itself. So the other option is, once it is all enabled, you'll notice the button in the ribbon will appear, and when you select it, it will show the sensitivity labels that you have been authorized to access when a label has been published. So as an admin, if you're ever setting up the labels, be conscious that everyone might want their own label. You know, the finance director at A may want one, HR director at B may want one, ITC may want one, but you don't want to go too broad with your labeling, because you're going to get this massive list. Too granular, you'll get a massive list. But then if you go too broad, it might not be appropriate for what you're trying to do with your labeling. So I know in Australia, we have an IRAP federal standard, which has things like protected, top secret, sensitive, those sorts of aspects, official sensitive. We use those sorts of labeling in other locations around the world and other industries. There's different labeling that applies for those industries and for those countries. So you may want to consider adopting a labeling strategy that is set up for an industry or for a legislative requirement. And you can adopt to those as opposed to internally everyone just creating labels. The labels can be grouped, so you can have a group of labels and they'll appear in the drop down as a group. So you can drop down, you'll see the parent group, but you don't select the parent, you go into one of the children and pick one of those. So that's another way to sort of organize your labels. Once we've applied a sensitivity label on our Power BI desktop file, we'll see it appear in the bottom left. So as soon as someone's applied a label, they'll see it in the bottom left. And they can also see it in the top next to the report name sometimes. So in the Fabric service, you'll see it up the top next to the report name. In things like Excel, Word, Power BI Desktop, you'll also see it down the bottom in the status bar. So if someone is sending a Power BI report file around, or you're accessing it from SharePoint as just a file that's stored there, you'll see the label there. Once you've published it to the service, the really cool thing with this is you think about all the different use cases you could use, because this information is a clear text metadata and it is visible at almost all times. So when you're in the list view of a workspace, you can see the sensitivity label that's been applied to all those items. So you could use this for even medallion approaches where you're doing bronze, silver, gold. You might want to use actually the task flow for that now, but you could use it for that. You could use it for unvetted and vetted. You could use it for public versus confidential. You can use it for all sorts of things, but because it's a metadata piece of information in clear text at the item level, it's great to be able to use these features for something. Once you've got it there, you can also see it in lineage view. So if you're looking in lineage view, you will see it as a little icon next to the name of the item. So inside Fabric, you'll see the little shield picture, and that can also have a color coding. And if you hover over it, it will actually show the value for that little shield. So if it's confidential, it'll say confidential and the description. So the things we specify when we create the label appear there, so a user has that information at hand. When we're in a report itself, we can see it right up the top, so next to the name. And in the new Fabric space, we now see it more clearly. You'll see it displayed with the shield icon, so the shield and the label. And then within the ribbon or card, once you've selected the name, you'll also see it there. And you can see it if you double click to edit it, because that allows you to edit the sensitivity label as well. So when you're looking at any Fabric items, you can open them up, double click the little label at the top, and that will allow you to see the value selected, and you can actually change the value if you have enough privileges. So that's what a report looks like. Data mart is the same. So the difference with things like data marts, dashboards, data flows is that you set them within the service itself. So as you're building them, you'll build them out, and then you can either hit the little ... sign, the little ellipses next to an item, go into the settings, go into sensitivity labels, and pick from the drop down there. If you have multiple accounts, make sure you're logged in with the correct account to use and access the label so that you can set it appropriately, or you can open the item and double click up the top, and that will give you the little card, and then you can select from the drop down there. And once it's been applied, you'll see it in the sensitivity column as you did with the report. So here's the other option where you're going to settings and you're actually going in, and you can see there we've got the list of sensitivity labels and we can select them. If we're looking at the Fabric items specifically, so Dataflow Gen 2 and Pipeline, we can go into the properties of those items and set it from there. So the first one is Dataflow Gen 2, we see it in settings, and for Pipeline, we can see it in the properties. So we can go in and set the sensitivity label from that screen. And those will appear on the item up the top. So you'll see it all the time. Lakehouse is the same. The Lakehouse SQL endpoint is actually derived from the Lakehouse itself. So you don't set it on the SQL endpoint. You'll be able to visibly see it, but you don't actually set it there. You set it on the Lakehouse itself. And a notebook can also have a sensitivity label applied. So you think about all these things anytime they're working with data or they're actually storing data, you can set a sensitivity label. The one thing I don't like about these when it comes to Lakehouse and Warehouse and even Event House is because those are multiple data sets. They've got lots of data, lots of different files in them, lots of different tables, lots of different attributes. You can only set one label though at the item level. The difference there being with things like Azure SQL, Azure SQL MI, you can set a label all the way down to a column, and you can set it at an item. So you have multiple levels that you can do it. But with Lakehouse and Warehouse, you can't, and Datamart, they only have the item level. So when you're setting these, be mindful of what is your information governance policy. A lot of the times people, when they're working with data and working out their governance strategy, they'll go down to as granular as they can, and they specify the data owners and then get an understanding of what the sensitivity label is of those data elements. And then they look at the risk levels associated with all of them being combined together in the one location. So a lot of times information management and the data governance comes down to the risk to an organization as to what that is. So let's say you have things like PII and financial information and addresses and, company budgets all in the one warehouse. Be mindful that even though those in isolation might only be, say, official or official sensitive, when you combine them all together, they may take a higher priority data governance aspect, and therefore the label of the item may be higher because of that, because you want to make sure that the item is set appropriately so that people use it appropriately within the org. So anytime you start to use these sensitivity labels, they're not on their own. They also need to come with data governance processes within your org and information protection policies and guidelines. So if you start to roll these out, what I would recommend doing a lot of the time is do little pilots, set up a series of labels that you think will be appropriate for your org, pilot them with the org, check how they're used, check how people understand how to interpret them, and then adjust them accordingly, and then look to roll out further. And then as you're seeing good adoption rates, consider switching over to more mandatory requirements. So sort of over a 3 to 6 month period, you might then shift to, all right, every Power BI report now has a mandatory label applied, because we want to make sure that the information is protected and used in the right way. And then you accompany it with policy so people know, hey, if this says commercial confidence, don't send it out onto some news media outlet or use it for a public article. Or if it says, it's raw, unclassified, bronze, unvetted, make sure before you're going to use it to make a business decision or determination that perhaps there's a bit of vetting going on in the data to make sure, okay, this calculation is as we expect and it's using this data, and it's okay that this data goes to these people. So same with warehouse here. This is an example showing the color coding as well that you can use. So some industries use color coding associated with their sensitivity labels, and then you've got the label name itself, and it's all nice and visible in plain text. If we try and do things like export to Excel, we're lucky enough that Office does have an element of security in it. So when a user tries to export a data set, so let's say you've got a sensitivity label restricted to the finance department, for whatever reason, a new user's come on board and the IT department gets a request saying, hey, model this user on Joe Blogs, and they add them in. But that means they get access to finance, and they don't, they get access to the finance workspace, but not the finance, say, sensitivity label. They go into the workspace, they can see the reports, they can work with them, they can work with them interactively. As soon as they try and export a visual to Excel and open it, if they don't have access to the label, Excel will error to indicate, hey, you need to be signed in with an account that has access to this label. So you have a little bit of security there, but not a lot, because they still could have looked at the report inside Power BI. It's just that they couldn't export it to Excel. But this is good because it may prevent users from exporting it to Excel, sending it to their Gmail account to do some work from home when they really should look to use some internal practices, or it can help with getting those internal practices stood up in your org if you don't already have them. The other one with the Excel files is, you can see down the bottom an Excel file that has a sensitivity label applied. Once it's published to the service, it just gets a nice little dash. So workbooks do not get sensitivity labels. This is the same when it comes into Purview as well. If you're using Microsoft Purview and you do a scan and you bring in all the data from your Fabric tenant, the workbook won't have a sensitivity label there either, but the sensitivity labels on the items will flow through. Now, I've not verified that for the Fabric items specifically, but I can tell you for the Power BI items within Fabric, yes, other than workbook. If we're looking at a downstream scenario, so we have that downstream tenant setting selected. So here you can see I've got a data set with confidential. And then when I go and try and create a report off that, Fabric's kind enough to tell me that, hey, this data set has a label applied, so I'm automatically going to apply a label to yours, and it's going to be confidential. So when I publish that report out, it's going to say that report is now confidential, labeled report. If we're in Excel and we're actually analyzing with Excel, so if we're in Excel, we go into, even though it's Fabric data now, they still call it from Power BI in the Get Data menu. And then you see the list of data sets available. So this includes things like your lake houses and your warehouses. The downside, this used to show the sensitivity label as clear text as a descriptor. Now it's only got the visual icon, so you can see the little padlock appears, and with the little padlock, if you hover over it, you get details of what label that is. I preferred the old format where I could actually see what the label was straight away, but still this is good to know that if our users are using Analyze in Excel and they're going to look at our lake house, our warehouse, our event house, or KQL database, I should say, that they will see the labeling applied there. So then when they go to use it in an Excel file, so if I say, yep, I want to import that in, Excel's savvy enough to let us know that there's a sensitivity label here and we're going to apply it to your Excel file. So now you can see up the top there, Excel will say, hey, this is a confidential file now, just so you know. So if this file does start to get sent around or stored in OneDrive and accessed by people, that sensitivity label will kick in. But that's all the different labeling we can do. What can we do with things like monitoring the labels? So we've stood up the labels, we've created a different set of labels that we want. From there, we've gone ahead and applied the labels to our different items. So I showed you a couple of the items. You can do it on more. So of course, we could go in and set it on a dashboard. We could go in and set it on data flows if we wanted to. But how do we actually monitor it? Now, this dashboard is available in the admin monitoring area, so it's kind of like a restricted one, unfortunately. But if you were to go into the admin monitoring workspace of Microsoft Fabric, you would see the Purview Hub. And within the Purview Hub here, you can automatically see some stats about your data. So we can see that if we were to look at how is our classification rollout going, how's our sensitivity label application being worked on, my tenant's not so good. It's only 11% of my items have actually been labeled. And then we can see what labels are being used by item. We can also see then over time, as we start to do a push in our organization to create labels and apply them, we can go through and go, hang on, is that label actually working? What are we seeing it get applied to? Like if we suddenly saw a massive spike in one particular label being used, then the chances are that label is either the default label or it's because everyone's afraid to pick the wrong label. So they pick the highest security one because they go, well, I don't know, I'm not sure, I'm just going to pick this one. But anytime you do that with sensitivity labels, if they're attached to an industry standard, that usually means different controls in your workspace. So I've worked in organizations where they've put a protected on, and protected means a whole different physical security aspect. So the data can only be accessed through certain desktop machines. It can only be viewed in certain locations. You can't have like windows available to see the data. There's all these different restrictions you have to apply. So if you start seeing that pattern of behavior, that's a great time to go, all right, organization, we need to look at doing some training, some guidance, and seeing why people are setting it. Or if it's the default label, why are people not setting the label up? It's because we haven't let them know that we've implemented a new strategy to use sensitivity labels, or is it because we've implemented guidance but it's not clear, or they need additional training methods? So if we've only published, say, user guides in Word, maybe they are more visual people and they need to see actual examples of how to pick a label. So walk through those scenarios and say like a Teams recording and make it available on the internal intranet to say, hey everyone, this is a guide on how to apply labels. Or start to look at business champions within your organization and pick out a few and put them through a bit of a train the trainer scenario and go, hey, this is the approach to sensitivity labels. This is the guidance we want you to use for applying them. This is how you use them. This is where you use them. This is how you select them. And then from there, see if they can help adopt within their business area. And then see how that changes and evaluate that over time. Because as time goes on, the people change, the work changes, the labeling may change, the approach may change. So you need to constantly be evaluating, is it working what we've got? Is it too granular? Then we need to reduce it. Now, if you delete a label, don't worry. The existing assets that have the label applied will continue to have the label applied. Just new assets won't be able to have it. And I believe, if I remember, if a Power BI PBIX has it, you can't download it. So you have to kind of change it so you can download it. But there's all those things to be mindful of as you're rolling out something new. It's like, and then use these tools. So if this was in Purview, it gets even better. So when this is Purview Hub, so Purview Hub is like your lightweight mini portal of Purview. If you were using the full Microsoft Purview and you did a data catalog and you had scanned in all the Fabric items, you would see the sensitivity labels there as well, and you could do usage information to see what assets are using it versus what assets aren't. But it also means you can go more deeper and go look at exactly which items that applies to. So from here, if we go into this report a bit further, if we go to the sensitivity label page, we can now see different items within that page. So I can go in and see that, hey, all my data sets, they're only 10%, 12%, I should say. So it's flagging them to let me know that, have you considered upping these sensitivity labels on all of these so they have a label applied? Because right now they don't have a label applied. We can see that confidential from our top insights is the most used label. So this might be our quick way, like if we check this once every couple of weeks to go, okay, what is the top most used label? And if it's unclassified, then all right, we need to look at why. Or if you start to seeing that behavior, you might make it mandatory to force the issue to make sure that people are applying a label to remove the risk. Well, not remove, but mitigate or reduce the risk to your organization. We can look and see that, we've only got 142 items without a label. So it's not a huge amount of effort to go in and relabel those things. I've not looked into APIs to change the labels, but I can imagine 142, a few clicks, it won't take too long to go through a workspace and fix that up. Go into the settings of each one. Not ideal, but go into the settings and change it and then reevaluate this stat to see, yep, it's the same. But I can also see here if it's attributed to a particular workspace. I might have just a business domain that's not executing on applying the labels. So I can look at what workspaces have the problem and then go, okay, let's talk to the owners of those workspaces and look at what strategy they're doing and try and get into a better space. And the other fun thing we can do with this is, we've created it, we've applied it, but can we monitor it in a different way? So this is one way to monitor it. The other way to do it is through the audit log. So within the Office 365 audit log, we have the option to actually filter the activities down to applying a label, creating a label, changing a label, deleting a label, and setting a label on a Lakehouse item. So it's not every single Fabric item, but it's still something that's being recorded in those audit logs. Unfortunately, the audit logs are something that are restricted to, say, the Fabric admin, Power BI admin, Global admin, and I think the Power Platform admin role. So it's a little bit exclusive to get access to these audit logs, but it is another way to be able to go through those audits and see, hey, how is my labeling getting used? Is it just a particular business unit on a Friday goes through and reviews and applies the label, or is it, every single time someone publishes a new item, they're setting the label, or are they waiting, a week or two between creating the item and actually applying the label because we've done a security audit? If you are getting audited, you can use the audit log to actually view that information and see how you're tracking. So there's all different ways you can do with these labels. They're really, I think, what's the word? They're like not highly used around the world from what I've seen, but they're an item in your toolkit that you can use. Like if you've got the licenses, why not give it a go? Why not look at using these label practices? I remember when I saw them, I often see them in orgs for Outlook and email. That's the first place I see them get rolled out. So the other thing to be mindful of it as a data professional, if you want to do labels, you can't just define them for the data estate. It has to be collaborative across the entire org. So it's a good opportunity to work with your global admins, your cloud teams, and your Power Platform teams if you have them separated out that way. If you're lucky enough to have a data governance area within your org, or it might be something that you consider, hey, my org doesn't currently have a data governance practice, and we may look to introduce that either as a new role, a new team, a new department director, or as a part of an existing role, so that you can introduce these sorts of things into your org, because governance is going to get more and more important, more and more leveraged. Copilot can recognize sensitivity labels to an extent. I've not dived deep on that, but I can imagine that being another powerful tool for us in the data platform world to be able to go, hey, if people are using Copilot and they're interrogating the data, what does that mean for us? If they're looking at it from, hey, Office 365 and they're interrogating SharePoint, which has sensitivity labels, can we make sure that, say, Excel files are not being interrogated by Purview unless you have access to the label? If we're looking at it in terms of Fabric and we're using things like, the notebook behavior with the Copilot in there, is it recognizing if something is masked on our warehouses, or if we're using the warehouse and Copilot's interacting there, or building the Power BI report and Copilot's interacting there. What is the behavior that the label can help us with or not help us with? But I think it's also good for users using these assets to go, hey, this report has this classification, treat it this way. And it could be as simple as the report is good to go, use it, or nope, the report is currently being tested, so don't use it for anything. But it's something that is available in our toolbox. And I figure I left some time in case anyone had questions.